The cause of Lee's death was listed as a heart attack, with throat cancer being noted as a secondary cause. He was 64 years old.
Two men, same Hollywood. One became America's untouchable cowboy hero. The other spent 13 years playing nameless villains until a car accident nearly erased him completely. John Wayne and Lee Van Cleef shared sets, shared the Western genre, and represented two visions of the American frontier that couldn't have been more different. While Wayne enforced Hollywood conformity from the top, Van Cleef fought a system that told him his face was wrong and his talent was wasted. What happens when the face of American Westerns meets the face Hollywood told to change? The face Hollywood rejected. Stanley Kramer saw something in Lee Van Cleef's stage performance that convinced him the young actor belonged in High Noon, one of 1952's most anticipated westerns. Van Cleef had been touring with the production of Mr. Roberts, earning solid reviews and building a reputation as a capable stage actor with an unforgettable presence. When Kramer approached him about joining the cast of High Noon, Van Cleef thought his break had finally arrived. The role Kramer had in mind was Deputy Harvey Pell, a speaking part with real screen time, the kind of opportunity that could launch a film career. Then came the condition. Kramer wanted Van Cleef to surgically alter his nose, make it less angular, less menacing, less distinctive. The features that made Van Cleef's face memorable on stage, the sharp cheekbones, the piercing eyes, the prominent nose, were exactly what Kramer wanted to fix for the screen. If Van Cleef wanted the speaking role, he'd need to change his face permanently. Van Cleef refused. It wasn't about vanity. It was about refusing to erase the very thing that made him who he was. If Hollywood couldn't accept his face as it existed, then Hollywood could offer him something else. Kramer did. Van Cleef got a role in High Noon after all, as Jack Colby, one of the silent henchmen waiting at the train station. No dialogue, no character development, just a menacing presence in the background while Gary Cooper's heroic marshal faced down the bad guys. That single decision, choosing his face over Hollywood's approval, defined the next 13 years of Lee Van Cleef's career. He became the villain, film after film, year after year. Sharp features meant a bad guy. Piercing eyes meant gunslinger. A distinctive face meant henchman number 3. Van Cleef played killers, outlaws, and thugs in over 40 films and television shows between 1952 and 1965, almost never speaking more than a handful of lines. Meanwhile, John Wayne's conventional all-American looks, square jaw, warm eyes, approachable features, guaranteed him heroic lead after heroic lead. Wayne never faced an ultimatum about his appearance, never had to choose between surgical alteration and a career opportunity. His face fit Hollywood's narrow definition of what a hero should look like, so Hollywood made him the biggest Western star in the world. Would you alter your face permanently for a bigger role? The irony wouldn't become clear for over a decade. The features Stanley Kramer wanted Van Cleef to surgically remove in 1952, the sharp angles, the intense eyes, the menacing look, would eventually become his signature in Europe. Sergio Leone would look at that same face and see perfection. But in 1952, that revelation was still 13 years and an ocean away. Van Cleef chose his face over Hollywood's approval. For the next 10 years, that choice seemed catastrophic. He played henchman after henchman, sharp cheekbones and piercing eyes, marking him as the bad guy before he said a word. Meanwhile, John Wayne's conventional all-American looks guaranteed him heroic leads, film after film, year after year. Wayne never had to choose between his appearance and his career. But in 1959, something happened that made Van Cleef's typecasting look like the least of his problems. The wilderness years. The 1959 car crash didn't just injure Lee Van Cleef's knee, it shattered the fragile foothold he'd built in Hollywood over 7 years of villain roles. The accident was severe. Van Cleef's knee took the worst of the impact, damaged badly enough that doctors delivered a devastating prognosis. He'd never ride a horse again. For a Western character actor in 1959, that wasn't a medical opinion, it was a career death sentence. Westerns dominated television and film, and Van Cleef's entire professional identity revolved around playing gunslingers and outlaws. If he couldn't mount a horse, he couldn't work. Hollywood's response was silence. Offers stopped. Casting directors moved on. Van Cleef, already typecast in minor villain roles and now physically compromised, became unemployable. He'd been barely scraping by before the accident. Playing nameless heavies didn't pay well, but at least he'd been working. Now, nothing. Van Cleef later admitted he began to lose interest in his apparently waning career. That's a polite way of saying he watched everything he'd worked for disappear while he recovered. By 1962, Lee Van Cleef wasn't acting anymore. He was painting houses. For 3 full years, 1962 through 1965, Van Cleef worked as a house painter in California, earning manual labor wages to support his family. He'd married Joan Drain in 1960, just a year after the accident. While other newlyweds might have been building careers and planning futures, Van Cleef was climbing ladders with a paintbrush, his knee barely functional, his acting career a memory. During those exact 3 years, John Wayne was making some of the most iconic films of his career. In 1962, Wayne starred in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, John Ford's masterpiece about the death of the Old West. He appeared in The Longest Day, the star-studded World War II epic. He commanded the highest salaries in Hollywood, enjoyed uninterrupted A-list status, and never came close to the kind of professional catastrophe that destroyed Van Cleef's momentum. Wayne's career was insulated. His conventional looks meant he could age into distinguished leading man roles. His political connections protected him. His long relationship with directors like Ford guaranteed work. Van Cleef had none of that. 3 years away from your dream career, could you come back from that? Van Cleef was painting houses in Los Angeles while Wayne's face appeared on movie screens worldwide. The contrast wasn't just professional, it was existential. Wayne represented a Hollywood system that valued marketability over resilience, conventional beauty over distinctive talent. If you fit the mold, the industry protected you. If you didn't, if a car accident revealed how expendable you really were, the industry walked away and never looked back. By 1965, Lee Van Cleef was 40 years old. He'd spent 13 years typecast, 3 years painting houses, and seemed destined to be forgotten entirely. John Wayne, meanwhile, was entering his 3rd decade as Hollywood royalty, the living embodiment of American Western mythology. Everything about their careers suggested Van Cleef's story was over. But 5,000 miles away, an Italian director named Sergio Leone was about to prove that Hollywood's vision of the Western hero was catastrophically narrow. Same set, different worlds. A John Ford set, 2 Western actors. One got star billing alongside James Stewart. The other played henchman number 2. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance wasn't just another Western. It was John Ford's meditation on the death of the Old West and the birth of modern America. Ford had been making Westerns for decades, and this film represented his most mature, elegiac take on the genre he'd helped define. For the lead role of Tom Doniphan, the principled frontiersman whose tragic fate embodies Ford's nostalgia for a vanishing world, Ford cast his longtime collaborator, John Wayne. For the role of Reese, one of Lee Marvin's villainous henchmen, Ford cast Lee Van Cleef. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Wayne's Tom Doniphan was the moral center of the film, the man who does the right thing in the shadows, while others take credit in the light. It was a meaty, complex role that gave Wayne one of his finest performances. Van Cleef's Reese was a nameless thug with limited screen time and minimal dialogue. Pure typecasting as the sneering heavy who exists to make the main villain look more threatening. Same legendary director, same iconic Western. Opposite ends of the Hollywood hierarchy. Ford's relationship with Wayne dated back to 1939's Stagecoach, the film that made Wayne a star. Over the next 2 decades, Ford directed Wayne in She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, Fort Apache, Rio Grande, and The Searchers, films that cemented both their legacies as architects of the American Western myth. Ford saw Wayne as the embodiment of his idealized frontier values: strong, silent, morally certain, conventionally heroic. Van Cleef got a few minutes of screen time as a guy who gets shot. Ever worked alongside someone doing the exact job you wanted while you were stuck in the background? The irony is that the man who shot Liberty Valance was explicitly about the Old West dying and a new, more complex America being born. The film's famous final line, "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend," acknowledged that the romantic vision of the frontier was always a mythology, not reality. But Ford himself couldn't escape that mythology pooper when it came to casting. The legend required heroes who looked like John Wayne and villains who looked like Lee Van Cleef. Van Cleef's career status in 1962 made the situation even more brutal. This was filmed between his 1959 car accident and the 1962 to 1965 period, when he was painting houses. He was barely holding on, and this Ford production, which could have been a lifeline instead, reinforced exactly the typecasting that was killing his career. The man who shot Liberty Valance told the story of the Old West dying and modern America being born. What John Ford didn't know was that the same transformation was about to hit the Western genre itself. The clean-cut heroes and nameless villains, the system that made Wayne a star and Van Cleef a henchman, was about to be demolished by a new kind of Western. And the director who would destroy Ford's mythology was about to rescue Lee Van Cleef from house-painting obscurity. Leone's Revolution. Sergio Leone looked at Lee Van Cleef's face. The sharp cheekbones, the piercing eyes, the menacing features Stanley Kramer had wanted surgically altered, and saw exactly what he needed. Leone was building something Hollywood had never attempted. Westerns, where moral ambiguity replaced moral certainty, where anti-heroes operated in worlds without clear good guys and bad guys, where survival mattered more than righteousness. He'd already made a fistful of dollars with Clint Eastwood, creating the man-with-no-name archetype that turned traditional Western heroism on its head. For his next film, For a Few Dollars More, Leone needed someone to match Eastwood's intensity while bringing emotional depth to the violence. He needed someone whose face told a story before they spoke a word. Leone chose Lee Van Cleef, whose Hollywood career had yet to take off after 13 years of trying. The role was Colonel Douglas Mortimer, a revenge-driven bounty hunter with a tragic backstory, hunting the man who murdered his sister. This wasn't a nameless henchman with 3 lines of dialogue. This was a co-lead alongside Eastwood, a complex character whose pain and precision drove half the film's narrative. Van Cleef brought something Eastwood couldn't: emotional range. While Eastwood maintained the same steely-eyed, cool demeanor throughout the film, Colonel Mortimer expressed vulnerability, rage, grief, and determination. The menacing features Hollywood had rejected became Leone's tool for showing internal conflict. Every line in Van Cleef's face told the audience this was a man who'd lived through hell and come out the other side changed. For a Few Dollars More made Van Cleef a box office draw, especially in Europe, not in America, where John Wayne still dominated. Not in Hollywood, which still couldn't imagine Van Cleef as anything but a villain. In Europe, where audiences embraced Leone's darker, more cynical vision of the West. Van Cleef's salary jumped from approximately $5,000 per film during his Hollywood years to significantly higher European rates. For the first time in his career, he was being paid like a star. Leone cast him again in 1966's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly as Angel Eyes, the Bad. It's one of cinema's most iconic villain roles, but calling Angel Eyes simply a villain misses Leone's point. Angel Eyes is a professional killer who operates by his own moral code. He's ruthless, efficient, and completely self-interested, but he's not a mustache-twirling heavy. Van Cleef played him with gravitas and presence, creating a character who felt more real than any of the black hat villains Hollywood had been churning out for decades. What if the problem was never you, just the people who couldn't see what you were capable of? The geographic split said everything about the state of the Western genre. In America, Wayne remained the king, starring in traditional Westerns that upheld frontier mythology and American exceptionalism. In Europe, Van Cleef had become the face of a new kind of Western. Grittier, more violent, morally complex. Spaghetti Westerns were outgrossing American auteurs internationally. Van Cleef had to leave Wayne's Hollywood to become a star, but once he did, he helped demolish the very aesthetic that had rejected him. Leone's Westerns weren't just commercially successful, they represented a complete philosophical rejection of everything John Wayne's Westerns stood for. Wayne's heroes were morally certain, clean-shaven, and always on the side of law and order. Van Cleef's European characters were morally ambiguous, weathered, and operated in a world where survival mattered more than righteousness. The face Hollywood told to change became the face of a new kind of Western, and Wayne's Hollywood couldn't compete. The Hollywood Wayne built. While Lee Van Cleef fought to survive Hollywood's aesthetic conformity, John Wayne was busy enforcing a different kind of conformity, one that destroyed careers, ended friendships, and made dissent professionally lethal. Wayne wasn't just a beneficiary of Hollywood's system, he was an architect of it. Wayne was what one historian called a proactive inside enforcer of the blacklist, denying employment and undermining careers of many actors and writers. This wasn't passive political belief. Wayne actively worked to ensure that anyone suspected of leftist sympathies couldn't work in Hollywood. He was a vocal supporter of Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade and, for a time, a member of the controversial John Birch Society. The culture Wayne helped create demanded conformity on every level. Political conformity, flag-waving patriotism, anti-communism, unwavering support for American military actions, aesthetic conformity, clean-cut heroes, clear moral lines, traditional gender roles, ideological conformity, belief that America represented civilization, bringing order to savage frontiers. When does protecting your values become destroying someone else's career? Wayne's political activism extended beyond blacklisting into the films themselves. In 1968, he directed and starred in The Green Berets, a pro-Vietnam War film released just as American opposition to the war was reaching mainstream acceptance. The film was savaged by critics and underperformed at the box office. Meanwhile, spaghetti westerns, which questioned American exceptionalism and presented morally ambiguous protagonists operating in corrupt systems, were thriving internationally. The disconnect wasn't coincidental. Wayne's politics and his aesthetic were inseparable. He believed in heroes who fight clean and villains who are obviously evil. He believed in stories that reinforced American values and traditional morality. Katharine Hepburn, who worked with Wayne on several films, observed that Wayne suffers from a point of view based entirely on his experience. He was surrounded in his early years in motion pictures by people like himself, self-made, hard-working, independent. That narrow worldview created a Hollywood where Van Cleef's menacing appearance had no place in heroic roles, and where the kind of morally complex westerns Van Cleef would eventually star in represented everything Wayne opposed. Wayne didn't personally blacklist Van Cleef. There's no evidence Van Cleef's politics ever made him a target. But Wayne's enforcement of industry conformity created the culture that rejected Van Cleef at every turn. The demand for physical conformity that led Stanley Kramer to demand that Van Cleef change his face. The aesthetic rigidity that kept Van Cleef trapped in villain roles for 13 years. The political conservatism that made Hollywood's 1960s establishment hostile to the morally ambiguous anti-heroes that European audiences embraced. Wayne believed he was defending American ideals. He saw the blacklist as protecting the country from subversion and his films as celebrating the values that made America great. But the Hollywood he helped build, one that demanded physical conformity, political loyalty, and aesthetic rigidity, was exactly the system that nearly destroyed Lee Van Cleef. Van Cleef never publicly attacked Wayne. He didn't have to. By 1970, Van Cleef was a European icon, starring in morally complex westerns that represented everything Wayne's Hollywood rejected. The work spoke for itself, but there was one more twist in their divergent legacies. Legacy, buried with Best of the Bad. On December 16, 1989, Van Cleef died of a heart attack in Oxnard, California. He was 64 years old. When his family chose his grave inscription for Forest Lawn Memorial Park Cemetery in the Hollywood Hills, they didn't try to distance him from the villain roles that had defined so much of his career. They celebrated them. Best of the Bad wasn't an insult. It was a tribute to Van Cleef's ability to take the typecasting Hollywood imposed on him and transform it into something iconic. John Wayne had died a decade earlier on June 11, 1979. He was buried with full American hero honors, eulogized as a patriotic icon, and awarded the Congressional Gold Medal on May 26, 1979, his 72nd birthday. Wayne died representing the establishment, celebrated by the same Hollywood system that had made him a star in the first place. Van Cleef died as the template for every complex anti-hero that followed. How many modern anti-heroes can you think of who owe something to Lee Van Cleef's refusal to be Hollywood's conventional villain? Over a 38-year career, Van Cleef appeared in more than 170 films and television shows. The early years were typecasting and struggle. The middle years were injury and exile. But the final 2 decades, after Leone rescued him from house-painting obscurity, established a legacy that rivals Wayne's in unexpected ways. Wayne represented American certainty. Van Cleef represented moral complexity. Wayne embodied the establishment's vision of heroism. Van Cleef became the outsider who transformed into an icon precisely because he refused to conform. Hollywood told Van Cleef to change his face in 1952. Europe told him his face was perfect in 1965. Wayne died beloved by the system. Van Cleef died as the inspiration for every morally ambiguous protagonist in modern cinema. 2 graves, 2 legacies. John Wayne, American hero, flag waver, defender of the traditional Western. Lee Van Cleef, Best of the Bad, the man who proved villains could be complex, anti-heroes could be stars, and morally ambiguous Westerns could change cinema forever. Wayne never had to choose between his face and his career. Van Cleef made that choice in 1952, and 37 years later, his refusal to compromise became his legend. Lee Van Cleef didn't need to publicly hate John Wayne. The contrast between their careers said everything. Wayne's conventional looks guaranteed heroic roles. Van Cleef was told to surgically alter his face or accept villain typecasting. Wayne dominated Hollywood for 3 decades. Van Cleef painted houses after a car accident nearly ended everything. But Van Cleef's refusal to conform created the modern anti-hero. Which legacy matters more? Establishment icon or revolutionary outsider? Drop your thoughts below.